All right, let's just cut right to it. This is the question that's been on every tech leader's mind, right? Does AI really make developers more productive? We're not going to guess. We're going to look at the data, specifically from a massive Stanford study that looked at the work of over 100,000 developers to finally get some real answers.
It all kind of blew up with this, let's call it an explosive quote from Mark Zuckerberg back in early 2024. Now, whether he was serious or just trying to juice the stock price, who knows? But the effect was immediate. It sent this huge shockwave of pressure through the industry. You can just imagine every CEO turning to their tech chief and asking, "So, when are we replacing our developers with AI?"
And of course, that led to this really dramatic, almost existential question, are we actually watching the end of software development as a human job? Well, as it turns out, the answer is way more complicated than just a simple yes or no.
Now, before we get to the big answer from all that Stanford data, we have to understand why this is such a tricky question to begin with. Turns out, for a long time, most people trying to measure developer productivity have been, well, looking at all the wrong things.
So the first big mistake is just counting stuff. You see these studies that say, look, developers are committing more code, productivity is up. But more code doesn't mean more value. In fact, what the research shows is that using AI often just creates a whole new task, fixing all the bugs in the messy code the AI just wrote. You end up just spinning your wheels, looking really busy but not actually getting anywhere. The second flaw? These sterile lab experiments. A lot of studies put developers in a bubble and have them build something totally new, from scratch. We call that a greenfield project. And yeah, AI is fantastic at that. But that's not the real world, is it? Most developers spend their days in brownfield projects, wading through these massive, complex, sometimes ancient code bases, and the rules in there are completely different. And the final flaw? You can't just ask people. Seriously. The Stanford researchers found that when you ask developers to rate their own productivity, their answers are not great. On average, they misjudge their performance by 30 percentile points. That's so off, it's basically a coin flip. So, if counting commits is misleading, lab studies aren't realistic, and surveys are pretty much useless, how in the world do you get a real answer? Well, this is where the Stanford study gets really brilliant. They came up with a whole new way to measure this stuff that cuts right through all that noise.
The way they solved this is actually fascinating. See, the old gold standard was to have a panel of human experts review code, but that's super slow and costs a fortune. So what the researchers did was build an AI and train it on those very experts to automate the whole process. This let them analyze millions of code changes, not just by how many lines were written, but by measuring their actual functional impact. In other words, what does the code do?
Okay, before we dive into the results, we need to get this one key term down, rework. This is super important. This isn't just improving old code. Rework is specifically the wasteful effort. It's the time you spend fixing or totally changing code that was just written, a lot of times by an AI. Think of it as a hidden cost.
All right, we've set the stage, we get the methodology. Now for the good stuff. What did the data from over 100,000 developers actually show us about AI's impact?
And here is the headline number. At first glance, AI gives you this huge productivity boost, right? About 35%, according to the data. But then, you have to pay the rework tax. The time spent fixing the AI's mistakes eats up about 15% of that initial gain. So what you're left with is a net productivity increase of about 20%. Now that's solid, it's good, but it's not quite the revolution some people were expecting.
But that 20% isn't the whole story, not even close. The real magic is in the details. The actual gains change wildly depending on the situation. So for a really simple task in a brand new project, you can see a massive 30 to 40% boost. But take a really complex task in a messy existing code base, the gain just plummets. Sometimes it's almost zero. So the big takeaway here is that the kind of work you're doing is everything.
And it gets even crazier when you start looking at programming languages. For popular languages, Python, JavaScript, the AI has tons of data to learn from, so it gives you a pretty solid boost. But for the less common languages, think something like COBOL or Haskell, it's a totally different ballgame. For complex tasks, the data shows AI can actually cause a productivity loss. Yep, you heard that right. It makes you slower because the code it generates is so bad it just creates more work.
So when you put it all together, a really clear pattern emerges. As a project's codebase gets bigger and bigger, the productivity gains you get from AI get smaller and smaller. And it makes sense, right? An AI just can't hold the entire context of a huge, mature project in its head. The signal just gets lost in all that noise. So what's the big takeaway from all this? What do you actually do with this information? Well, the study doesn't just give us data.
It basically hands us a playbook for how to use these AI tools in a smart way.
The most important lesson here is that these AI coding tools are not some magic wand you can wave at any problem. They have a sweet spot. And this checklist right here shows you exactly what that is. You want simple, repetitive tasks. You want new, greenfield projects. You want popular languages in small to medium code bases. If your task checks all these boxes, then yeah, AI can be a massive game changer for your productivity.
So in the end, the data shows us that all that initial panic was really missing the point. AI isn't here to replace developers. It's a powerful tool for sure, but a tool with very clear limitations. And that reframes the whole conversation. The real question isn't man versus machine. It's about designing the perfect human-AI team, a team where human creativity and critical thinking work together with AI's speed to build better software faster. Now that is a question worth exploring.